there comes a point in your career when the torch must be passed, and I've reached that point. I will not be seeking re-election to this United States Senate seat.
The number 2 Democrat in the U.S. Senate announces his retirement, and the race is on to elect his successor. From Capitol News, Illinois, it's Friday, April 25th, and this is Capitol Cast. Hello and welcome to Capitol Cast, a regular podcast of Capitol News, Illinois. I'm Peter Hancock, and joining us again this week is my colleague, Ben Salinski. Ben, thanks for being here.
Hello, Peter.
So, U.S. Senator Dick Durbin finally made the announcement this week that everyone in Illinois politics has been waiting weeks, if not months, for, after what will have been a 44-year career in Congress, including 14 years in the House and coming up now on 30 years in the Senate. He will not run for re-election in 2026. So to put this in perspective, he was first elected to the House in 1982. That was the year of Ronald Reagan's first midterm election. He was elected to the Senate in 1996. That was the same year that President Bill Clinton was reelected to a second term, defeating Kansas Senator Bob Dole. Durbin himself reflected a little bit on his tenure. You and I were both at a news conference in his backyard here in Springfield, and he talked a little bit about what kind of a career he has had. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I've worked with some extraordinary people. I've witnessed history being made, and I think of the people I served with, Teddy Kennedy, John McCain, the list goes on and on from there. And they have basically, as far as I'm concerned, made history, and I witnessed it, was part of it in some instances. So that was important to me. But I'll also tell you that getting things done that make a difference in the lives of people I represent makes all the difference in the world. I look back, for example, on something I did in the House of Representatives. It seemed almost inconsequential to ban smoking on airplanes. It ended up being a tipping point, and the whole problem with health care and tobacco changed with that as a starting point. People started saying, if secondhand smoke is dangerous in an airplane, well, what about a bus? What about a train? What about an office building? What about a restaurant?
Okay, Ben, so he goes back that far. He was instrumental in banning smoking on airplanes. It almost seems kind of incomprehensible now, the idea that people used to smoke on airplanes as well as on in restaurants and all kinds of other public places, in buses. So to put this in perspective, I mean, in terms of Illinois politics, how significant of a figure do you think he is, and how will we look back on that lengthy career?
Yeah, he's certainly someone where it's really hard to imagine what life in Illinois politics is going to be like without him around. He has been there for 4 decades. It'll be 44 years when he wraps up. And he's been the senior senator for more than 2 decades now. He's been, I think it's also notable to say that he's been the number 2 Senate Democrat since 2005. So not just is this a big change for the state of Illinois politics, but it's a big change for the institution of the Senate leadership as a whole as well. So I think, when we look back at Illinois history, I think Dick Durbin holds a pretty significant place, as the successor to Paul Simon. Paul Simon was a big mentor to Dick Durbin, and he ultimately ended up filling his seat following the 1996 election. But those two men both have one thing in common that I think really stood out from Durbin's news conference on Thursday, and that they're both men from downstate. Paul Simon is obviously well known as a champion of downstate Illinois. They're both Democrats. Dick Durbin from Springfield for most of his adult life. So I think it's really notable that, the way the Democrat Party has shifted in the state of Illinois, there's just such a large portion of that population is now in the Chicago area. And it feels like that Dick Durbin almost represents kind of a last bit of downstate Democrats, this kind of group that isn't as influential as they used to be when Paul Simon was a senator from Illinois. So I think, going forward, I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of measure Durbin's legacy, potentially based on his successors, as, it's more than likely that the next person's going to come from the Chicago area. Durbin had such a great influence downstate, as did the people who came before him, that I think that will be part of his legacy, is that he was an influential downstate Democrat.
And you also mentioned his long-time leadership position in the Senate. He's been the Democratic Caucus whip, which means a lot of different things, but primarily means that he's the person in charge of making sure that the votes are in line. The Democratic caucus's votes are in line in the direction that they want to go. So maybe he didn't necessarily have a long list of legislative achievements of his own, but he certainly helped a lot of other people get their achievements through, including fellow Illinoisan President Barack Obama. Can you talk a little bit about what his role was during the Obama administration?
Yeah, it's safe to say, I think, even coming from statements we've heard from Obama this week, that there is no President Obama without Dick Durbin being a mentor. Obama goes into the Senate in 2004. Dick Durbin is the senior senator now at that time from the state of Illinois. And, he's also taking over a leadership position at the same time that Obama is entering the Senate. So really, he served as a big mentoring role because Obama's political career just flew so quickly. But then moving forward as president, Durbin was an early backer of Obama for the office, and it seems like he was a very significant guiding role for Obama during his 8 years in the White House. One of the signature achievements of the Obama administration was the establishment of DACA, and one of the bases for that is the DREAM Act, which Dick Durbin has been sponsoring in the Senate since 2001. Now, that bill has never passed, but a lot of the principles in that go into what we now know as DACA and that kind of path to citizenship that Dick Durbin has always envisioned.
Right. That's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which at the time was basically just a policy under the Obama administration, and also was upheld, I think, during the Biden administration. Just kind of basically setting a priority that non-citizens who came here as children, maybe their parents brought them across the border, they've grown up here, they've lived here their whole lives. It's just they are not going to be a priority for deportation or for any kind of immigration enforcement action. And in fact, there would be a pathway to citizenship for those people. I guess the other major thing I think most people will remember President Obama for, and also maybe Dick Durbin, is Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act that extended health insurance to millions of Americans who otherwise wouldn't have had it. Did he have much of a role there?
Yeah, I think one of the main things that Dick Durbin is going to be remembered for is all those big things that were accomplished that passed through Congress during Obama's administration were ultimately signed by him. Dick Durbin had a hand in all that as the number two in the Senate. He, as the whip's job is to, as you said, add up those votes, make sure that these bills have what it takes to pass through the Senate, and it's especially hard to pass the Senate because of the filibuster rule. So really, you could say that Durbin, well, maybe some of the biggest bills didn't have his name at the very top of the list. He was influential in passing just about everything that the Senate has ever approved when it was under Democrat control. So I think that's going to be a lot of his legacy, is that he got things like Obamacare across the finish line. He helped get the required number of votes on big pieces of legislation like that to make sure it ultimately got to President Obama's desk. But even before that, President Bush, and even after President Trump and Joe Biden, even when Republicans would be in control, and you needed to have that bipartisan legislation.
Okay, so a significant legacy that he's going to leave behind, no doubt. But we also can't ignore the fact that his bowing out leaves a giant vacancy, and there is no shortage of Illinois politicians who now are eyeing that seat with the idea of moving up, starting with Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton, who barely 24 hours after Durbin's announcement was made public, announced herself that she intends to run for the seat. And in something that may have surprised some people, at least, was the almost instantaneous endorsement she received from Governor J.B. Pritzker, who made that this Friday morning, at an event in the Chicago area. Let's listen to what Governor Pritzker had to say right after that event.
Now, as you know, anybody who wants to run should run, but I'm telling you, this is the person who's best able to serve with integrity, with honor, somebody who brings with her a tremendous amount of experience helping to run the state of Illinois. Juliana Stratton's the right person for the job.
Okay, so Ben, did that surprise you at all, the idea that the governor would come out? I mean, I guess it's not terribly surprising that he would endorse his own lieutenant governor. They have been partners in politics for several years now, but that the governor would come out so early and make such an emphatic endorsement when it's certain to be a crowded field.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of choices for voters in this, and whether other statewide office holders like Juliana Stratton run for this office or not still remains to be seen. But, there's going to be a lot of people who do have good name recognition, Lauren Underwood, other members of Congress who are considering running. So I think it was a little bit surprising just how fast the governor decided that he was going to endorse in this race. The other day he said, well, I think Juliana Stratton is a fantastic partner. She's been great for us. I have nothing to say right now as far as an endorsement goes. And of course, the next day here on Friday, we find out that he's supporting her. But, for those of us who've watched the governor constantly, especially over the last few months, it's been very notable how much Juliana Stratton has been part of all these news conferences, all these conversations. She's always there in the picture right alongside the governor, making similar statements, weighing in on the big political issue of the day. It almost seemed like a lot of the work over these past few months has been to increase her name recognition so people know her face, know her name, know what she stands for. And a large part of that as the lieutenant governor falls to Governor Pritzker to elevate her and put her into that position to be able to, do some of this work that she's going to be able to run for the Senate on. So, the endorsement, of course, wasn't surprising. I think it will be interesting, though, to see how the rest of this race goes, given, the top Democrat in the state. The endorsement that every Democrat wants when they run for office is already committed to a lane. And, Governor Pritzker is generally pretty popular here in the state of Illinois. He's won re-election very easily two times. So, it does seem like it almost does create an uphill battle for anybody else who gets into that race, no matter how well known they are.
Well, and this announcement obviously creates kind of a chain reaction up and down the political ladder in Illinois. First among Democrats, many of whom have been waiting patiently to move up the ladder for a long time, while Dick Durbin's held that seat for close to 30 years now. I'm just sort of wondering, is there a danger for Governor Pritzker, who has political ambitions of his own? He's constantly being rumored as a potential presidential candidate in 2028. Is there a danger that by going out and endorsing somebody who may or may not win, that he could end up looking kind of weak if Juliana Stratton ends up not being the nominee?
Certainly, I think, if she ultimately did not win a primary, it would look like Pritzker's influence isn't as strong as it seems here in Illinois. We've seen his endorsement get thrown out in a lot of races, and in most cases, he's been pretty much successful in every endorsement he gives. But, he doesn't just throw his endorsement around, to anybody who asks for it. He's always very measured in it. But one of the things we haven't really seen in Illinois, really since 2018 when Pritzker got elected, was an opportunity for Democrats to move up the ladder. The constitutional officers have been all the same outside of the change from Jesse White to Alexei Janulius at the Secretary of State position. But even that race wasn't, the biggest political fight that Illinois has ever seen. It was interesting. It was a new opportunity for Democrats to get involved and to move up the ladder. But for the most part, everybody who's been in some of these big positions has been the same. So there really hasn't been many huge opportunities here in the state to test the influence of Pritzker's endorsement. It's been in a lot of smaller local races, legislative races, maybe a congressional race here and there. So I think, in some ways, this is actually one of the first big tests of how much do people actually care what does Governor Pritzker actually think about somebody.
Okay, and in talking about this field, and we all assume it's going to end up being a crowded field, let's start on the Democratic side. In addition to Lieutenant Governor Stratton, who are some of the names being talked about? You mentioned a few there earlier, Lauren Underwood. Who else is out there?
Yeah, we've heard this week that Lauren Underwood is certainly considering it. We've heard from Robin Kelly, who represents a lot of this area south of Chicago down to Kankakee, that she is also interested. She was statewide chair of the Democrat Party for a little while as well, so she does have some pretty decent influence within the party. But we've also heard that Raja Krishnamurthy, a Democrat from Schaumburg in Congress, that he is potentially considering running. He did a whole big statewide tour earlier this week, which is certainly notable that he's holding events well outside of his district. So those are, I think, the biggest three that we're watching. But there's been other names thrown around from a couple lawmakers in the General Assembly. Mike Frericks has also been said to be interested in running for the seat. He's the state treasurer, which sometimes comes with a little bit of name recognition because of what that office does and some of the ways it gives money back to the state of Illinois and to the residents. But Senator Durbin did tell WBZ in Chicago that there could be as many as 12 candidates who are interested in running. Durbin said he's heard from a lot of people who have called him and said, hey, I want to run. I just don't want to primary you. So we'll kind of see how this field shakes out. There's probably some names that we certainly haven't talked about or thought of who might end up throwing their hat in the ring.
And Durbin himself said very pointedly that he does not intend to endorse anybody. He intends to let the voters decide unless there is some extreme circumstance that would force him to make a choice. Let's look a little bit now on the Republican side. You talked earlier about how the state has kind of become bifurcated between Chicago and the suburbs being heavily Democratic and most of downstate Illinois being heavily Republican. And Durbin himself even talked about the fact that, so-called downstate Democrats are almost an endangered species now. So on the Republican side, who are some of the names being thrown around?
The most obvious one is Darren LaHood, a Republican congressman from the Peoria area. He's been in Congress a long time. He does have pretty good name recognition. He's got a very, very large district that stretches all the way from Peoria up to the Wisconsin state line and across much of north central Illinois. So he represents a lot of people. People know who he is. His district boundaries have changed a lot. It used to go down to Springfield and then up to Peoria. But he's got a decent amount of influence in Congress. He's been in office for a long time. He's generally seems to be well liked by the people in his district as well. So he's a name that is being watched as somebody who could be interested in this seat. But then this really, I think, turns to a broader conversation about the state of the Republican Party is who is on the bench who would actually be a viable candidate to run for this office. And that's where there's not a lot of names that get thrown in there. Fundraising is one of the biggest challenges here. And there's also other statewide offices that we're watching for. There's the Senate seat, of course, here with Durbin leaving. Obviously, there was going to be a Republican primary there anyway. But then there's the governorship, and that's an area where it's possible that Republicans would really like to make a difference and actually put forward a candidate. But we're not even hardly hearing many names actually who are interested in running for that seat. Not a lot of serious rumors. The most serious candidate that we've heard so far is the sheriff of DuPage County. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for Republicans, is to find somebody, in addition to Darren LaHood, who has name recognition, can raise money, and actually present a viable alternative to the Democrats.
And Darren LaHood did post a statement on social media, on X, formerly known as Twitter, that was intentionally vague. He mentioned that, quote, Illinoisans are ready to turn the page in light of Senator Durbin's retirement, and that, quote, I will work with Illinoisans across the state to ensure our next U.S. Senator will work with President Trump to lower inflation, cut taxes, secure our border, and protect our streets and families. Darren LaHood, of course, being the son of former Congressman Ray LaHood, is certainly a different kind of politician, different kind of personality than his father was. He's been very closely aligned with President Trump, whereas his father served in the Obama administration as transportation secretary. So those are, you mentioned that he has high name recognition, but that recognition comes largely from his father, who was a very different kind of politician, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be one of the challenges for LaHood or any other Republicans is, Darren LaHood is very closely aligned with Donald Trump. They've deferred in a few areas that have been kind of notable, but largely, I think the issue for Republicans in Illinois is going to be making themselves independent of President Trump. Now, the challenge is, if there's a big primary here with a lot of attention, one could think that Donald Trump's endorsement, or somebody who's closely aligned with Donald Trump, that's what it's going to take to win the Republican primary. But as we've learned, especially in the last several election cycles, is that support from Donald Trump is not exactly going to help you win statewide in the state of Illinois. Illinois votes for Democrats. So they need to present a moderate point of view and positions to voters, when they meet the general election. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges for Republicans and people like Darren LaHood, who can probably pass that primary test, but can they, make themselves moderate enough like Ray LaHood to potentially have statewide attraction for more voters?
Okay, well, more to come on the 2026 election for U.S. Senate in Illinois. But for now, we're going to leave it at that for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, this is Peter Hancock with Ben Salinski on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team saying thank you for listening.